when I was just listening to you, Judy, I remembered something I learned at the Unity Church in Knoxville. And it was a little sentence that the minister taught us. And so I'm going to share it because it's really good. It says, when you hear a siren or emergency vehicles or anything of that nature, you can go, no need to hurry, no need to worry. God is already there.
Oh, I love that. Thank you.
And that's both empowering, and it's also turning it over and having a mastery. As far as sounds and things, it just depends, I think, on what else is going on with me as to whether something is an annoyance or not. I have really loud bells. It's like the what do you call it? The tubes that make the sound are pretty long. I bought it years ago at Costco, but anyway, it's very melodious. And so it was making a lot of melodious sounds because we've been having a lot of wind lately. And I just choose sometimes to see it not as an annoyance or an intrusion, but as a comforting sound. And just kind of using it as more of a reminder to myself, and that I can hear, and that I have that gift of hearing. But it's really how you're letting your mind wander or not wander or take control, because you can see a sound or hear a sound in many different ways. And just like the siren can signal that somebody is getting help, as opposed to going to fear or anxiety about it.
The community where Thich Nhat Hanh has been a part of in France for decades, they have a practice that whenever a bell rings, you stop and slow down. And so you may not have as many bells, but you choose something, and you decide what it is that helps you to just remember to stop and slow down.
I hear the church bells here in upstate New York in Geneva 5 times a day. And every time I hear them now, it is a pause for me. I stop whatever I'm doing. I silence any kind of technology that I may be on, and I just am silent for that. It's 5 minutes at least.
Yeah.
I go on and on. And that's a wonderful idea too, with the wind chimes, to just embrace the beautiful sound and just take pause.
Just take pause, because there's not much in our life that asks us to take pause.
Right.
Well, you're in our life, Jim, and you ask us to do that every week. And I just want to mention tonight at 7 is Lent, 7 o'clock our time. So if you want to join Jim and all the rest, you can take pause in that way.
That's like 3 in the morning, New York.
Yeah, you guys have a good time.
10 o'clock at night now. Yeah.
Do you record those, Jim?
I did once. I haven't been recording most of them, but somebody asked specifically if would I record it for them, and I did. So if anybody needs a recording, I can, but I don't typically.
Okay. So should we move on to chapter 2?
Absolutely. So chapter 2 is about listening to others. And how many have a plethora of others to listen to? Not all of them easy. Many of them of the intrusive nature that we were talking about before. And it's how to listen to those voices very intentionally and in an open way. So the first section in here really kind of set of ground rules to help us to figure out how to do that listening. And so it talked about 2 kinds of listening to that other and listening to ourself in the midst of that conversation. Now we're going to get more to that other later on at the end of this chapter, and then next week is a lot about listening to ourselves. So this chapter is more about how to hear others in all the different ways that they speak. And the myriad ways that they are communicating, and if we choose to listen, we can hear much more than just the words coming out of their mouth. So they talked about tone, right? What tone are they using? How many ever had someone dear to you say something that said they were all right, but their tone told a different story, right? And do we listen well enough to hear that? Do we stop and accept the tone, not just the words? The hard part is sometimes listening to just the words is very convenient, because if I don't want to listen to that person much anyway, and they say they're fine, then you just fly on. But the tone can sometimes bring you to a different spot. One of the lines that I liked best about this section is said, the listening path is active, not passive.
Yeah.
And our own listening practice is usually a combination of those two, right? What brings you to greater activity in that listening path, and what challenges you to be more passive? What are some of the things? For example, my relationship to the person often helps me to be more active, or can help me to be more passive. If I don't like the person, if they're not very important to me, if, you know.
I think it's about acquaintance and relationship with that person. Of course, you'd have a different interaction with someone that you don't know and you're passing on the sidewalk.
Yeah.
Say hello, how are you? And then more than likely people just keep going, versus if it was a friend or family member, you might stop and engage. So I think it depends on the depth of your relationship with whoever you're speaking to.
Yeah. Thank you. How about the rest of you? What helps you to move from passive to active? What kind of things around you?
Well, it would depend on the topic that they're talking about. You know, if it's a big deal, like their health or some, world crisis, or if it's talking about, their recipe for pumpkin pie. I mean, that would be important, the topic.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't do small talk very well.
I don't either, Judy.
It tends to annoy me, and because there are real things that I want to hear about that person, rather than just how's the weather. And the year I spent in England, I can't tell you how many times people just wanted to talk about the weather, which was always dreary.
Yeah.
Compared to Tucson. And it was like, really, we can't go any further than that. And it was a lesson.
Yeah.
Because sometimes maybe language and conversation is cultural as well.
Right.
Absolutely.
Good point. Yeah.
And you learn that really well if you have to interact on a regular basis with somebody from a different culture. So let me tell you about one of the ways that I learned that really well. It's when I started becoming a bilingual teacher. For 9 years, I taught first, second, and third graders bilingually. And I learned very quickly that some of the things that you learn as an English speaker, English liver in the world, don't work with Hispanic kids. For example, if a kid does something wrong, what do we typically do as Americans? We look at them, we begin to scold them, and we say, look at me when I'm talking to you, right? And all my little Hispanic kids would typically look away. Do you know why? No effect. And so when I was saying to them, look at me when I'm talking to you, I was telling them, don't be respectful to me.
Mm.
Very interesting.
They were looking away as they'd been taught culturally to do in order to say, I'm hearing you, I'm understanding you. And so we have to be able to look and hear what it is that that other person, how our behavior is affecting their behavior and what's going on in that interaction.
And how did you learn that, Jim? How did you figure that out?
I had two good mentors, Gloria and Hortensia, who helped me they were both native speakers, and we did a whole lot of work that year as we were beginning these bilingual classes of trying to figure out what was helping and what wasn't. And so they're part of who helped me to do that. But you've got to, I mean, in all cases, you've got to look at what it is, how that other person is communicating. Whether or not it works for you, you have to figure out what's going on in that other person.
Mhm.
It's kind of like a formula, or it's kind of like a menu, in that, as I'm thinking about it, it's an exchange. And so you might start with something more routine or mundane because it is safe and it's a way of joining and connecting. And then you can bring up what's really on your mind or what's really happening. And so it's a courtesy. It's like a mannerly, but understanding what somebody else's system really is around what constitutes listening, what constitutes having good manners where that other individual is concerned, what their need is in the interchange.
Let me give you one more word to put that, because everything that you talked about there was exactly right. But I think it's also history. You've got to have you've got to build that history of how does this person listen? How do I speak as I'm talking to them? And vice versa. If I'm trying to force them into my communication pattern, I might become frustrated. If I'm trying to learn how they speak, I have an opportunity to go deeper. And that's why I liked this section, because I don't know if you noticed, as she talked about her, 315 friends, each one related differently, right? And so what she's essentially saying to us is, you've got to look at each person and figure out what are the things that are important in this particular thing. Now, there's some general rules we can make, but they don't always fit, right? One of the things you learn, one of the authors, one of the speakers talked about that they had ADD. And an ADD child, if they have something in their hand to fiddle with, they listen better. If you tell them to put that thing down and just listen, it's a much harder process for them. But you have to get over the rule that you learned that said, don't play with something while you're listening, because that can be a non-listening behavior, can't it? I've sometimes used it that way, at least. But it can also be a way that increases listening if you are listening to that person's life and that person's speech.
We have to be very multilingual.
We have to, in a lot of different ways.
Mm-hmm.
Nancy, you had a couple of the different multilingualness of this going on, like body language. Talk to us about what you saw in all of this.
Yeah, I think I'm aware as a teacher of body language from a kid, or even an adult. If you're talking with them and their arms are crossed and their legs are crossed and they're looking away or whatever, I look at people's eyes to see where they go. and if they're kind of with me or not. So that would be part of listening, is the body language and a tone of voice. And sarcasm sometimes can be a real issue. It's like, oh, especially with my husband, oh, you were being sarcastic there. I didn't realize that. And then it takes on a whole other meaning, like you were this morning, Jim, mentioning my sister, cousin, whatever, Ann Wilson. And it's like, wait, what? I missed that. But yeah, sometimes you're not on track, the same track as that person. Or even if the emotion, I think people's emotions, where you are at emotionally, if you're down or happy and the other person is not on the same emotional plane, the listening can be quite different in that way too. I found the chapter long, and that she had a lot of people kind of saying the same thing about how important listening is to their careers or just, their lives. And I don't know if you noticed this, but in the try this boxes, there were like 18 in this chapter.
Wow.
And I was mentioning to Jim that if you all wanted to choose which one, they're similar, to use as homework this week, that would be your choice. Then you could share it next week. One of the things, before I forget, did you receive, Jim, my part of the interview with Julia Cameron?
Yes, but I haven't tested it on this computer yet to see if it works.
Okay. So if that works, she did an interview, a webinar with a book club or a bookstore in Vancouver, Canada. And so I taped 4 minutes of it. So Jim might be able to send that out to you. It's kind of interesting to hear her voice and see her face. And she's 73, and she reiterates a lot of what she said in the book. But I think you might enjoy that if Jim can get that up and share it.
Okay.
Yeah. Then the believing mirrors was another thing I wanted to mention. Catherine, you're shaking your head. What did you remember about that?
Well, it struck me that you do have to have people in your life that you can sense you and that you can sense. And the other thing I wanted to say with that is that if I'm always calling somebody because I've got something on my mind to say, and so I have an agenda, which often is the case with me, I'm going to confess that. And I realized that it's really important to do this other, to call just to listen or call just to check in. And I do that too. But to be more mindful, being deliberate, making that choice about what am I needing or reaching out for, but what can I also, what am I willing to give in this exchange? But then that notion of a listening, a mirror person is marvelous, because it's people that you trust, people that you know will always have your back, and that has your best interests at heart, and you have that give and take, that reciprocity, which I think was a word that she dropped into the whole mixture of the whole scheme of things. And finding, a few good men and women, a few good people that, you are that for each other.
And
I just want to tag on to that. She says that believing mirrors are people that make you feel expanded. And I would say also cared for. My cousin Ann is one of my believing mirrors, and I really appreciate her care for me. And she does help me feel expanded. I call her my agent because she's always right, trying to get me to do whatever. So I appreciate that. Anyway, little sidelight. Judy's another one. Judy's a great mirror person.
Well, yeah. The other key component as I'm thinking about this whole process is that it's done with love. It's always done with a love in your heart and mind. That is got to be present. That sense that you are loving and loved.
Yeah. And at the end of the class, remind us to take a few minutes to talk about like one of the last sections, which was about when not to listen, because
Right.
that's important, because not every person every time is who you need to listen to. And that has to do with love in that moment, figuring out how to be that person of love. So we'll get back to that. Nancy, any other points you want to make out of this first section?
You're
The
muted.
dog, I know, the dog was barking. So no, I was going to jump actually to the end on page 104. And that's about what you just mentioned, when listening tells us not to do something, not to listen to people. And then 107 was the other thing we were going to talk about, Jim. Do you want to take?
Let's hold those in, because those are kind
Okay.
of the antithesis of what I think the rest of this class is about. And that is about how do you step into those listening relationships? How do you develop those listening mirrors? How do you hear? How do you develop all the different tools that allow you to do this? So I'm going to hold up a couple of them that helped me. I'm going to invite you to lift up some that helped you. And so I'm going to start just with the very first section after that, which was sculptor as listener. And I loved the piece where it said, listening tells me what to do next. And so as they look at that block of stone, what they're saying is, how do I hear that stone that says, this piece over here on the right is the next thing to do, right? Because it doesn't matter all the time what it is that I might want to do. What is this other person, this other thing telling me? Well, so as I try to write my commentary, it used to be easier for me to write commentaries, sermons, and I don't know if you know that, we call it something different here, but commentaries, I used to say, okay, here's all the amazing knowledge I have, and I'm going to give it to you. I've learned to listen more and more to both the material and to the people as I try to form that, right? Where does it go? And sometimes I think I'm starting here and it takes me over here, which is not a bad thing, because if this is where I sense things are at, then that's what needs to be talked about. So that was important to me, is trying to listen so that I can hear what to say next. That really helps when I have the right answer for the other person. And instead of just blurting in my right answer, I keep listening long enough to hear that they were going to a different conclusion than what I thought. So
Jim,
am I that artist? Go ahead, Ann.
if I could ask, what is your, I guess conduit would be the thing I could think of. What is your conduit between your listening, then you have a feeling or a thought or something to go on to the next step of something? Like a sculpture, you were saying there's a big piece of stone and then they have a sense of they should do something here or there. What is your mental conduit?
So what I try to do is I do a lot of collecting, right? I have a lot of things that sit there, and I try to listen to which ones seem to be speaking to what's going on. And it is not what I think all the time. I have this really great piece that sometimes I will hold for weeks and weeks and weeks, and it's perfect and I want to use it every single week, but the rest, it's not talking with the rest, if that makes sense. And so what I try to do is see which pieces are talking together towards some goal.
Okay, that helps. Thank you.
When I hear you say that, I immediately think about things that are ripening, but not quite ready to be picked.
Wow, that's a great analogy.
Yeah, yeah. And what's been really nice about that, Catherine, is sometimes those things I've held, like there was a piece I used this last week that I wanted to use for a while, but this week it was perfect. It was the right week to use it.
Doesn't that feel great when it just fits?
Yeah, And I think that that's part of what we have to do with each other too. Even if I'm right in how I'm going to fix that person, solve that issue with that person, sometimes it's just not the right thing to say because that person's thought pattern is going in a different direction. So I listen well enough to hear what needs to be said next, what needs to be done next, not just what first pops into my head.
Go ahead.
Isn't there another thing that happens that I find is that I might be listening keenly and I've got a juicy thoughts. And if I let the other person run with it, or I let somebody else have the stage, they might say the same thing and they might say it better.
They might get credit for it, damn it.
Well, like all minds are joined, and you can just say, "Oh, that's part of my joined mind with you."
Yeah, and I think Julia Cameron dealt with that when she got down to the novelist as listener, that section where she talked about how when she scripts a conversation in a novel, she gets to figure out how the conversation goes. But being in an actual conversation, it doesn't always go according to script. And so sometimes when we're used to manipulating things, we become poorer listeners if we're not careful. I think that can really happen with some of those people that you're closest to, that you already know their answers, and you don't listen as well. So how do we not write the conversation out ahead of time? Is an important struggle.
Retraining ourselves and the other person, slip something unexpected in.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and then you'll see if they're paying attention or not, or if they bite.
Yeah.
So.
I think it also helps to realize our own limitations. And I don't mean that necessarily in a bad way. It's just that we don't know everything. We don't know where everything goes, that there's newness around the corner. There's newness out of that other person's mouth that might take us in a whole different place. And are we willing to hear, like the musician, right? She said that there's always a new idea. And are we willing to wait to see if that, not my tried and true idea, which is right and perfect, but what else can be? And that's where we truly begin, I think, growing in the listening. It's when we let those other new ideas, because I think all of us in our conversations, if we're not careful, do a lot of rehearsing the same thing we already said. Right? Partially because those things are tried and true and they work really well.
Right. Yeah.
But is there something else?
Yeah.
But sometimes too, that's a refinement of our thought. That when we realize we haven't said it quite as clearly as we want to, we rework it and say it again in a slightly different way, and it comes out. And it's clarifying for ourselves as much as for the listener. And I realized I was interested in the way she presented all the different ways in which listening was important to different people, and I thought, anybody could do that piece. Anybody could talk to a dozen people and write that down for them. And then I realized I've been consciously working on listening for most of my adult life, I think because I was forced into it, maybe not forced, but led into it by being a first grade teacher. I mean, I wouldn't have survived first grade as the adult in the room if I didn't know how to hear what the kids were doing. And now I'm in my home with my daughter, and she and her son both have what I feel is like supersonic hearing. They hear what's going on in another room, especially if it's about them. and and you know, it's a kind of vigilance with them. They, you know, they don't miss anything, and it seems to me to be kind of exhausting. And I don't want to go that far either. But there was one other thing that was kind of an issue for me, that she was objecting to people finishing other people's sentences or filling in words. And sometimes I find that really comforting, that somebody knows me well enough to know that that word is just lost in there somewhere, and they can put it in for me, and I can affirm it or deny it, and it's still going to be okay. But then again, that's based on the relationship. If the relationship is strong, that's okay with me.
Yeah.
And if somebody else does it, I can really rankle.
Yeah.
Don't tell me what I'm thinking.
Yeah. The other day, Joni and I were talking, and I felt like I said something that was akin to that story about the old married couple that tell jokes by saying number 14.
Yeah.
Right? It felt like that type of a conversation. And, that's not necessarily bad, that you know somebody well enough that you don't have to tell the whole story. You just say, remember the time, and all of that story comes back. The hard part is that you have to be careful that the other person might be telling that story with a different meaning to it. And so you have to not just hear the story as it was told last time, but hear the new story, and vice versa. And so sometimes when we try to finish the other sentence, it's because we're trying to put the same add on that's there. And it's not wrong to do that, but we need to also hear, we essentially need to ask, is that what you mean? You know, and be sure we're continuing to check to make sure it's still the conversation we think we're having.
Do you remember years back where you would say, I hear you saying, I remember years ago that was a technique, maybe it was some teacher seminar or whatever, but you know, that is a nice thing to say though. I hear you saying blah, 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 because then you get it right or you get it wrong. They'll tell you. Yeah. So to sum up what you've heard is not a bad thing to do. But I did want to add on to Judy. I do agree with you. Sometimes when somebody will add a word, what I was thinking, and it's the right word, I'll say, oh, you're right. That's it. That's it. So we've had this like communal idea together is kind of a happy thing. It's not always, you didn't let me finish my sentence the way I wanted to. It's like we are on the same plane, actually. Yeah. So that can be a positive thing. And I think just our dialogue right now, you know, the yin and the yang, well, I agree with this, I don't agree with that, is so true with our interactions with all the people that we have. Sometimes they go right and sometimes not so right.
Well, as we're speaking about this, because I can go either way, but I'm realizing maybe the other person is trying to join me, and maybe it is that they really are listening and they want to affirm or be a part of the experience. So maybe when I start to get annoyed, which I do or can do, maybe it's on me to think about what is their purpose in the process.
Yeah.
Instead of being critical or annoyed.
Well, and I think at least part of what she was talking about in all this is essentially, how do I use my interactions with people to develop listening mirrors, both myself as a listening mirror for them and them for me. How am I intentionally doing things? Almost all of those tried that were to do something with intentionality. Right? Sometimes it did feel very much the same way, but I think that's because you have to be very intentional a lot as you're trying to develop these skills. And especially as you're trying to develop the skills with this person, because you have to figure out what it is that's working and what it is that's not working in this relationship, whatever it is.
Oh, Jim, I'm looking at the clock and I'm thinking we should get to page 104 and 107,
Yes.
just so we have time to share that. I did want to add, and I think you'll all agree that chapter 2 is a lot harder than chapter 1, in that chapter 1 was about hearing the sounds in the environment. That's lovely because you don't have to respond or judge or any of that. It's like one way you hear it. Whereas chapter 2, it's a give and take. It's a conversation oftentimes. So yeah. All right. Just wanted to say that.
Well, let me introduce this section at the back where it says, when listening tells you not to, by telling a story from about 10 years ago. It was about this time of year, a little closer to Easter. It was Saturday evening, actually Sunday morning of Easter Sunday morning. I had a lot to say that day. Had sunrise service at 6 o'clock, had, the regular services, and, I had things to say that day. And all of a sudden, about 1 a.m, I get a phone call from Spencer. Spencer is my nephew that lives in Mesa, and he and some friends were in a van that had run off the road about 30 miles west of Yuma. And so they asked me, can you come pick us up and we can call our parents and whatnot. So we went over there, got a couple of cars. There were about 15 kids. We brought them back to the church. And suddenly I'm taking care of kids at 2 a.m. when I've got a 6 o'clock sunrise service, when I've got the big celebration Easter service. Intrusion happens, and you have to decide what to do with that intrusion, right? Doesn't mean you always turn it off, but there are times when you have to. When is it that you need to draw a boundary and say, this particular person, this particular situation is not one where I choose to listen right now? That takes some discernment, where we focus in and we say, is this a sound, a noise, a person that is worth listening to? Or do we, just like we talked about, Anne, at the beginning, those disturbing sounds, we hear them and we let them pass through our brain, through our soul, and we let them go. It's an essential task. And in some ways, it's the task of deciding which ones are your listening mirrors and which ones aren't. Which ones are the opposite of listening mirrors, the ones you don't want to look into because they're really not reflecting truth to you.
What do we do with those folks?
You just like those sounds, you let them slip through your consciousness. You don't have to give them the credibility that they think they want all the time. And that doesn't mean that that's a forever choice. It could be just, today, I'm about to go celebrate Easter and you're bringing death into my life. I'm not listening to that right now. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? So yeah. You have to figure out, not just is this communication bad, but is it the wrong time for it, the wrong situation for it?
Mm-hmm. I think with COVID too, this is a great opportunity to have a clean slate, being in isolation and having such a limited amount of communication with other people. And I'm forgetting words that I know how to spell very easily and words that I'm trying to remember. And so it's going to be a test. This is a really good guide and book to have now to try to learn better, because it's going to be tough out there in the speaking world again.
Absolutely. Right now, we are in the midst of a lot of different things that coincided and just almost crashed into each other. And we don't have to listen the same afterwards. Some people are trying really hard to say, I was listening really well already, so I don't have to listen. Well, maybe you do. Maybe it's.
I'm going to tell everybody you said I don't have to listen like I did. I'm going to say, well, Jim said I didn't have to listen to you anymore, so I choose not to. I'm going to use that.
Not every voice needs to be heard.
Okay. Oh, writing that down again.
Except for your cousin Nancy.
Did you say something?
Yes, I did. I'm going to move on to 107.
Yeah.
If you got your books around, it says taking our own advice. And she has this example of going out on a ride to go visit someone. And another friend says, oh, you shouldn't go. The roads are going to be bad. You should stay home. And she weighs that and she makes the decision, no, I'm going to go and it'll be fine. And it was. She took her own advice. And that example of taking your own advice, I think is a small example compared to bigger choices we have to make for ourselves, whether it's, where do I move? Should I move? Do I take this job or not? And usually when I have those big questions, I like to weigh it in my mind. And I do like to talk about them with people I trust and get their reflections. And then if they say yes or no, it's like, how does that feel to me? It might feel, yeah, okay, you're right. I'm going to go that way. Or it might feel, not so much. For me, it's like listening to my inner gut, listening to your gut that they say. I think that's listening to your hunches, listening to your intuition, and giving the intuition and the hunches respect. So I would just say taking our own advice is, of course, a very powerful thing that you want to be able to listen to yourself.
Great advice.
And that's a good lead into what we're going to do next week, because next week is listening to our higher self. So that we're very purposely listening to ourselves differently than what we have before. Especially like what we were just talking about, Anne. Pre-COVID, we heard a certain set of voices outside and within. Is that what we still need to be? Is the voice that guided me a year ago the voice that still needs to guide me today? Or can I learn to speak differently and listen differently to myself?
Mm-hmm.
What has this moment taught me? How's it taught me to listen differently?
Mm-hmm.
And don't you think that just the Zoom meetings themselves help us to have to listen to the people that have the green box around them?
Yeah.
And so that is a new way. If we weren't Zooming, we might all be talking at the same time, but we don't do that now. Something I wanted to share, I did a journaling listening activity with a girlfriend for about 20 years, where we would get together and we would time, you had 10 minutes to tell me what's up with you, and the other person would not speak, and they might take notes. But then the response to that was also timed. Okay, 5 minutes of responding, the other person couldn't say anything. And we would give each other homework and we graded each other's behavior. It was like crazy, but it was fun. And I got a lot out of it. It was very therapeutic without paying for a therapist. So sometimes, that whole timing each other as we talk, whether it's for real with a timer, or it's like, okay, we're going to talk for 10 minutes, give them at least the first 5. I think that's helpful. But when you go to the higher power, listening to the higher power, you can't divide up your time like that. You can't set a timer and say, okay, God, I'm listening. Let's get with it here. Give me an answer. Sometimes the answer comes in a dream, or maybe the answer comes in a walk, like that book that we were reading, Judy. The answer comes through the ants and the lizards and the sand. And Mike and I were talking about, I said to Mike, okay, what do you hear from an ant, Mike? And he talked about the pattern that they make. They're all working together in that line as they're carrying things. And okay, fine. What about a lizard? And he came up with the speed that they have for protecting themselves. And we didn't get to sand, but that I think those are all listening to the higher power.
Yeah. So let's look back at all the stuff you read this week. There's, like Nancy said, there were 18 try this. Yet you don't have to do all of them. 17 is enough.
That's good, Joe. That's good.
My higher power is disagreeing with that immediately.
What you want to do though is very intentionally try some of them. And don't just do the ones that seem easiest for you. Do some of the ones that challenge you a bit, so that you're really working to try to hear in a different way. All right. So I'm looking at the one that said listening as an act of love. And the try this was basically be alert for their enthusiasm. Do I hear them in that moment and encourage that instead of some of the other responses I might have? You know, do I say the thing that encourages them to speak more? That's part of what she's saying in some of these. And so you're developing in yourself that I don't have to be the primary speaker here. I can listen more. So look through those and find the ones that help you to go on. Okay.
And then we'll have them read chapter 3,
Read
listening to their higher self, and maybe do you get anything this week from your higher self that you would want to share? Just be alert to that. Of course, you don't have to share, but you might want to share.
Does anyone need me to send the chapter to you still?
Yes, please.
Okay, Catherine, I will get it to you. I've got it already copied and ready to go.
Yeehaw.
So let me ask one last question. We have like 4 minutes left. So each of you has no more than like 45 seconds. What did you listen to this week that surprised you? As you were listening, what surprised you?
I'll go first, and it'll be less than 45 seconds. So when I'm laying in bed, when I was a child, I would listen to my parents, and I could hear their footsteps because we had wooden floors, and my dad was slow and heavy. My mother's was fast, like, you know, her high heels. But then I started thinking about today, listening to my laying in bed, my husband's breathing and the dog's breathing, and just what a gift that is. Done. Judy, can you unmute yourself?
I'm still thinking. Jim always asks hard questions. What I had thought earlier was that I read a book when I was a young woman, which was ages ago now, but it's always stuck with me, that the measure of a conversation is a matter of refreshment. If you've had a conversation with someone, a mirror, you come away feeling refreshed rather than drained. And I've always used that as a kind of wonderful standard and celebration when I come away from even a chance meeting with someone. If I feel up afterwards, it's been worthwhile and perfect, even if it's short.
Thank you.
Refreshment.
Oh, beautiful.
Good
I
one.
like that.
Okay, what was the question? What did we listen to? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I wasn't listening. No, I was listening, but I want to make sure it's what we heard.
Yeah. What did you hear that changed you, that you heard differently than ever before?
Okay, I live in a 200-year-old row house, like a brownstone, and I'm on the ground floor, and there's two wonderful girls that live above me, and one walks like a moose. One is very dainty, and they're very loud, and I don't mind it because I like life around me. But I noticed when they went away for the weekend, it was so quiet. I missed knowing their every move.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. I mean, I literally know where in the house they are.
I think listening to the silence is such an incredible thing if you take the time to do it.
Silence is deafening.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, it's very difficult. And I love hearing their cats run down the hallway. Our homes are exactly the same. They're mirrored. And I love the cats running down the hallway. That's a sound I love to hear. Sassy, there's my cousin. There's my fur cousin.
There's that.
She's been wanting up on my lap for the last hour.
Oh,
Catherine, what have you been listening to? Catherine?
Oh, cool. Well, I think all sorts of things because I a year ago got hearing aids. I'm much more acutely aware of hearing and not hearing. And that's been my takeaway for the last year or so. But I had workmen at my house yesterday because I have a new heating and air conditioning unit and took most of the day to get it installed. But the interesting thing was it was noisy some of the time, but it was productive noisy. And I had interaction with these two guys and they were great.
no.
And they've just been partners working for this firm that I had come, although experienced at their trade. But they've been partners for just a couple weeks because one person was hired a month ago and the other person was hired 2 weeks ago. And so I always engage people in conversation and banter and just learning things and knowing things and just having fun. And one of them was tall and one of them was short. And so I got on to talking about it's good if you're tall, it's good if you're short to pick a tall partner, and it's good if you're tall to pick a short partner, because there's the tall guy could reach into my ceiling part where the air filters. He could do it without a step ladder. The short guy can get into tight spaces. And isn't that the way life is? And sort of an appreciation, what I was hearing and experiencing was an appreciation for both of them and what a good partner can bring to any experience, whether it's in the world of work or in your personal life and with your friends and family. And so that's what I got.
That's good.
Perfect. So keep listening. The metaphor that she used throughout the whole of this chapter was her trying to call her friends using a phone that doesn't work.
Yeah.
What we're trying to do is make sure our phones work, right? And do whatever we need to adjust them, to exchange them, whatever we have to do, so that we're listening, so we've got the tools in place to be able to hear each other.
Mm.
Keep listening, my friends.
Well, thank you, Jim. We will do that. Until next week, you consider the 3 tools, the morning pages, the artist dates, and walking if you can.
Amen. Thank you all.
Be well. Take care.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Sassy.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, Sassy girl.